welcome to the Paseo podcast. Really happy to have you here listening to us or watching us on our YouTube channel. We have two guests. One of them is a returning guest. But let's start with our new guest. Our new guest today is Laura Rodriguez. She is the Vice President for Government Affairs at the Center for American Progress. And we also have a returning guest, Federico A de Jesús. In this particular episode, he is in the role of advisor for the Center for American Progress. If people listen to the previous episode where we talked about the PR Self-Determination Act, you'll see that Federico is a man of many talents, wears many hats. Ultimately, we're super happy to have them both on the show today. Laura, Federico, welcome to the Paseo podcast. How you doing?
We're here.
Great. It's really, really good to talk to you.
Cool. All right, Laura, since you are new to the show, let's start off with you. What should our audience know about you?
Oh boy. Well, I have a big background in Puerto Rico, starting from my local government days about 16 lifetimes ago when I worked for the city of Miami. And as I'm sure everyone in your audience knows, there's a huge diaspora there of Puerto Ricans, and I became very close to a lot of the groups like the Puerto Rican Chamber down there, as well as Borinquen Health Clinic. And then, Puerto Rico has just followed me in many ways in my career when I moved over to Senator Bill Nelson's office. And then, of course, here at CAP, I got to work, with this team putting together policies to help people on the island, and it's been a real pleasure to continue that work and my kind of love affair with Puerto Rico and the people of Puerto Rico.
Great. Well, welcome to the show. Federico, what should our audience know about you?
So for those that don't want to go to the other episodes to find that out, really quick, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, really active political family, been in DC via Philadelphia first 2 years, then DC for the last 20, so I'm dating myself. Went to college there, fell in love with the city actually before I got there. My mom was born there, my grandfather studied medicine there. I went to Model UN in DC, so DC's kind of been my backyard for a long time, and I'm really active obviously in Puerto Rico issues, was working on the Hill and in presidential campaigns where I met Laura in one of those or another place. And so wherever we can cause good trouble, I usually tend to be around there.
Great. Well, it's good to have you back on the show. I would love to hear, Federico, I know you've answered this question already, but for people that haven't listened to the other episodes you were on, what part of Puerto Rico is your family from?
Sure. So on my dad's side, they're from Ponce, which is in the south, traditionally the second city of the island, as some know. And from my mom's side, from San Juan and Ay Bonito, in the center of the island, in the mountain towns. My great-grandmother was from Guayanilla, but lived in Ay Bonito most of her life. And so little bits and pieces from all over the island.
I think, Laura, you are the first Colombian to be on the Paseo podcast, so congratulations.
I'm just an honorary Puerto Rican. My family comes from Colombia, actually, and my connection to Puerto Rico is what I mentioned earlier. Is when I started my career in government and really working closely with the diaspora and everybody from the island was kind of how the connection came for me.
And happy to hear that you always have an invite to the barbecue. That's always good.
Thanks.
So Federico and Laura, you had both written this piece for the Center for American Progress. People can look it up online. It's titled, or the headline is "An Urgent Rescue Plan for Puerto Rico." In this piece, there's a specific part that I wanted us to focus on for today's conversation. It's that subhead that basically goes into, or basically names 8 actions the executive branch should take to aid the island. With one of those, of course, being to just work with Congress to actually get stuff done. So that's 1 out of the 8. But I'd like us to focus on the other 7. So I was thinking, Laura, we'll start with you and just kind of go piece by piece. What's the context behind each of these actions, and what's the impact they're going to have on La Isla? So would love it if you could help us take the deep dive, break down for us, that next action, that next executive action that should be taken. It was reestablish the president's task force on Puerto Rico. Can you share a bit more on what that action means?
Sure thing, Joshua. So one thing that I'd want to start with is the reason that we thought this was such an important piece to write is that we finally have somebody in the White House who's willing to listen. So what we really wanted to put together was something that said, hey, here are the steps to take. Not that they're easy. There's really nothing easy about any of this stuff, but that it gives them a map to kind of get to where we believe there are steps that could be taken to help people on the island right now. The first of those, like you mentioned, is reestablishing the president's task force on Puerto Rico. So this was something that was started under Bill Clinton's administration and had been kept going. And it was originally pretty narrow to look at the self-determination or the island status issues. But under the Obama administration, it actually morphed into something, in our opinion, that was a lot more, I don't want to say useful, but it expanded the scope of the task force to look at all the different ways to help the island. And it was a great start. So what we're asking is not just to reestablish it, but to reestablish it and give it some real authority and power by putting people in the agencies that are going to be able to help a lot of the issues in the island, people in Treasury, in HUD. We want high-level folks who are already there. We're not asking for another level of bureaucracy. We're looking at people who are already there to be put together in a room to be in charge of what the island needs and how they can help them. Part of this is with technical assistance. We've found that there's a lot of issues, and I know that when we go down to some of the other action items, we'll touch on some of this, but there's been a lot of issues on the island with technical clarity, language issues. And so we're looking at not terribly complicated solutions, but things that take real political will to do. And that's what we're asking them to do, to start with that, because once you are starting to focus on it from a high level in all the different agencies, then we start to get the ball rolling.
And bear in mind that under the Trump administration, the task force was dormant. It was never established. So obviously reestablishing it in itself is a great step, and beefing it up, like Laura mentioned, would obviously take us further.
I appreciate that context. So if I'm understanding correctly, like this task force theoretically would have like oversight over things like federal reconstruction efforts, would be able to be tasked with addressing any potential corruption or outright corruption on the island, figuring out ways to foster a more equitable relationship among Puerto Rican central government and federal agencies. Like there's a long list of things that this task force would be able to accomplish if it was in fact reestablished. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. And again, to the point that I made, like at the end there, is it's really just to get step one started, really, to get the focus on those issues, everything that you just said, and working with the different agencies, with the DOJ, with HUD, with, HHS, all of those agencies that really can tackle the problems that have been, plaguing Puerto Rico for so long, really because of a lack of will from the federal government to assist.
Laura, let's stay with you. The next action in this piece was waive the Jones Act for Puerto Rico. Can you explain what the Jones Act is and what waiving it would mean for the island?
So I'll do a little correction there for you.
Okay, go ahead.
Because actually we're not asking them to waive the Jones Act. We are asking for a 2-year pilot program to kind of explore what happens when the Jones Act is waived for Puerto Rico. The Jones Act requires for ships coming to the island to be made and staffed by the U.S. citizens only, right? U.S. owned ships, and for many decades, but for many years, especially recently with all the natural disasters, we've found that act has created bottlenecks for the island trying to get aid at a time when we really can't afford it. But it also makes everything a lot more expensive, right? Because there's that piece of that regulation that's, just stopping other ships that might be able to bring things in a little more cheaply from getting to the island. And so this is not a non-controversial request. So this is something that not everyone certainly agrees on. This is why it's been a contentious issue for many years in both US and Puerto Rico politics. And so we certainly understand that there are folks who do not think that it's, people cite national security as a risk and jobs, American jobs, et cetera. However, there are many different studies that have shown that many of these things may not actually be an issue, that the Jones Act is helping. And therefore, our proposal is kind of a middle ground, is saying, let's try this out for 2 years and see if, in fact, A, it actually does make a real economic impact for the island in a positive way, or B, if it really doesn't, or it really does, put a lot of people out of work, or it puts, security at risk. Let's put it to the test for 2 years and really see what it does in action, and perhaps put the whole question to bed finally.
Yeah, well, and we've had guests on before and talked about the Jones Acts, and it's one of those things, especially it just passed 100 years of when it was established, let's say 1920. It's a little mind-boggling that we haven't figured out a way to update that law. So it's really interesting to hear that, let's pilot this out and actually have hard data to point to, because all the other data I've seen, and this is actually mentioned in your piece, that it's been shown that the Jones Act costs Puerto Ricans $1.5 billion in added costs for goods. So especially like with the context of what's in the news currently with supply chain issues, rising inflation, it's already expensive to purchase goods on the island. Now restricting the ability to import goods is just going to exacerbate the issue for people that already on average the salary is 20 to 30 grand a year. So it's very much a pinch on the consumer. So it's fascinating that we haven't addressed this yet.
I would say one quick thing to kind of interject is that it does also apply to like Hawaii and Alaska, right? However, to compare Hawaii and Alaska to Puerto Rico, which is something that we also, are politically kind of dealing with, is like, we're talking apples and oranges here. Hawaii and Alaska don't have the same A, issues, B, incomes, right, as people on the island. And what we're talking about is really hampering that economy and the economic power of the people on the island in a real way, or so we think. So we're trying to find out.
The next action that was listed, and we'll kick it over to you, Federico. This action was extend relief to Vieques and Culebra. What would this action mean for La Isla?
Sure. So Vieques and Culebra are two small island municipalities off the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. Vieques being the largest one, about twice the size of Manhattan, but very densely populated. Both were used at target practice and military exercises for decades. The Navy left Culebra in about 1975, and they left Vieques after 60 years in 2003, where they used depleted uranium, napalm, Agent Orange, a bunch of toxics, and the rate of cancer, at least in Vieques, is about 30% higher than the rest of the island. In the case of Culebra, there's still military contaminants all over the beach. There's a famous picture that every tourist likes to take of that tank on the beach. But a few years ago, a literal bomb was floating on the beach. So aside from the health, the economy and tourism, everything is peaches in these islands. The reality is that life is tough. Ferries are the main mode for transportation for most Viequenses and Culebrenses who go to the main island for their healthcare, for other professional appointments, and so it's very taxing because it's unreliable and it's expensive. And because there's so much more disease disproportionately from the rest of the main island, they have to go on these ferries to get dialysis or all sorts of treatments for critical disease because there isn't a full-fledged hospital in Vieques after Hurricane Maria. So all of these issues are interrelated. Thank goodness that as we speak, the new director of FEMA is in Vieques. And so we're glad that the Biden administration is starting to address these issues. And in the essay that we published, we listed a few items on specifically which agencies can help with the healthcare component, the decontamination piece, and other portions that need the work of Congress.
And if I could just interject there, because that point that Fede just made, this is one of the things that we're very lucky that we were able to work with when we looked at the Puerto Rico report in this way. We were able to work with our healthcare policy team, our disabilities team, our transportation and infrastructure team, et cetera, a tax team, economics team, and they all took a look at it. So we had, while Fede and I wrote it, the input and the brain power really of all of CAP we were able to kind of harness that to find these solutions and to really dig into, as Fede just mentioned, which agencies can do what. I mean, we are making this, as not as simple, but as like I said, like a map. Like, here is what you can do, and here's where you can go to do it. And we've already figured it out for you.
Or so we think.
Or we hope. Yeah.
Next action item was boost federal agricultural support. Can you explain what that means and what that would mean for Puerto Rico?
Sure. It's very simple. Puerto Rico imports more than 80% of the food it consumes. The famous coffee industry in Puerto Rico is a shadow of its former self. When the Vatican used to get the coffee from Puerto Rico and the Queen of England. Now after Hurricane Maria, especially, a lot of the new, more artisanal or micro coffee growers were hurt, and it's coming back. But when you import 80% of your food and you have the Jones Act that makes imports more expensive, you're really talking about bad nutrition and bad economics for consumers. On top of that, since these are federal actions by the executive, there are programs that are only available in Spanish, for example, that USDA has that they could offer in Spanish so that people in Puerto Rico could take advantage of them. And there are programs that don't apply at all in Puerto Rico because of its colonial status. So there are things that can be done through the executive branch to really help boost more self-sufficiently. I know that it may seem ironic for the US government, that some would call the colonial power of Puerto Rico, to actually help self-sufficiency through federal programs. But in essence, that's what we hope to achieve, to have less importation of foods and other goods, and a more robust Puerto Rican agricultural economy.
That stat just blew my mind. 80% of food consumed on the island is all imports, just out of this world. Okay, the next action item was address ongoing public safety issues. Federico, if we could stay with you for this one, break this down for us. What would this mean?
Sure. So Puerto Rico has suffered from a crime epidemic for some time. It actually improved in the mid to last decade, but it's coming back. For example, I think it was in 2011 or 2010 per capita, Puerto Rico had more assassinations than Mexico per capita. It actually did improve significantly. After Hurricane Maria, there's been a large outmigration of police officers from Puerto Rico. So on top of all of the economic damage wrought by 15 years of recession, natural disasters, and the pandemic, now you have a shortage of police officers. And so we've also seen, unfortunately, a lot of rowdy tourists causing problems in Puerto Rico and disturbances. Frankly, sometimes violent fights that are unnecessarily, no matter where you come from, you just shouldn't have that in a society. And so there's an issue with narco trafficking. Because Puerto Rico is part of the US Customs Zone, Puerto Rico is kind of a bridge between the Caribbean and Latin America to the mainland in the US. And so because of that, Homeland Security and all of the federal agencies are really the ones that are in charge of entry and exiting Puerto Rico. And it's really the federal agencies that, do narco trafficking, obviously with immigration from the Dominican Republic and other islands. So it's really those agencies that should be beefing up the Caribbean border, if you can call it that, for the United States, to improve security, not just in the island, but also this is all reciprocal, right? Whatever batch of drugs or violent crime that starts in Puerto Rico, you can hop on a plane and go to Miami, go to Chicago, go to Wisconsin, and you'll be, on the receiving end of something that should have been handled by federal agencies in Puerto Rico before reaching the state. So this is one of those other areas that's mutually beneficial for both the island and the federal government.
Quick question. So you had talked about it from the lens of narcotics. With this action, were femicides also included in there? Violence, also like violence against the LGBTQ community? Like just looking at the stats there, I want to say for 2020 or maybe it was 2019, there was more than one femicide a week on the island. So just curious, like, is that also what you're recommending the focus be when you say address ongoing public safety issues, or is it more just from the lens of narcotics?
What you mentioned is obviously key. In fact, Puerto Rico was the U.S. jurisdiction with the most trans assassinations. So that's obviously unacceptable. The femicide rate is unacceptable. There has been a state of emergency declared in Puerto Rico. Obviously, there are, Violence Against Women Act funds and COPS programs that could help. But we also focused on police reform. In Puerto Rico, there was a consent decree signed between the Civil Rights Division by then attorney Tom Perez, who obviously was later labor secretary and then DNC chair. He signed the consent decree with the governor, then Fortuño, because of civil rights abuses from the police, mainly against protesters and students, but also against the Dominican population in Puerto Rico. And so we want to make sure that those consent decrees that have been signed by police departments, not just in Puerto Rico, but across the US, are enforced, given that when we started to write this, the Trump administration had dumped all of the consent decrees. Obviously, they didn't care about civil rights and police reform. Now we have an administration that does care. And hopefully, these are some of the steps they can take in Puerto Rico that hopefully could be replicated in other U.S. jurisdictions.
Laura, let's go to you for this next action. So second to last one, it was create a task force subgroup to recommend targeted challenges to federal regulations that do not comport to realities on the island. What does this mean?
That is a mouthful. A lot of stuff that is encompassed in that action. And it's really about parity for the island, and talking about making sure that the island is treated the same way that the mainland is treated, with programs such as SNAP, taxation, right? The tax credits. This is something that we're seeing that is happening temporarily in programs like the American Rescue Plan bill, but those are all temporary fixes. And what we're looking for is parity on a permanent basis, for fairness and to treat them as they should be treated, as citizens of the country that should be, enjoying the same benefits as everyone else. But Fede, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more specific there.
Sure. So we in the report, we do ask for parity and basically the same programs that the Biden administration promised they would provide parity for. And like Laura said, we've started on that road, but we still have several programs to follow. This subgroup would actually look at what circumstances apply specifically to Puerto Rico that might not necessarily comport to the cookie cutter approach for a state. And, I hate to do this, but let's go back to Hurricane Maria. Usually FEMA is set up to support the states, who are then supposed to turn around and provide logistics for local governments who are the first responders. But in Puerto Rico, because of the blackout, there were entire towns that were cut off either because the roads were blocked off because of lack of electricity or phone coverage. And so people were complaining that the food and the supplies weren't getting to them. And FEMA was saying, but that's not our job. That's what local governments are for. We gave the money and the sources to the state, but there wasn't any local government to think of. So actually, that's a case where FEMA could have actually, if the law was structured properly, aided directly to municipalities, to people who needed the aid, and not having to go through all of this bureaucracy. Another example related to disaster relief, Laura mentioned the Jones Act. Trump waived it for 10 days. That really didn't do a lot. And there were delays in delivering aid because of the Jones Act. And so there are particular circumstances, like, for example, the Stafford Act. I hate to go back to disaster porn, like some call it, but the disaster really marked Puerto Ricans forever. So hopefully with this report and some of the recommendations that the Biden administration's already started to take, we can adjust policies to comport to the reality of Puerto Rico, as opposed to some generic jurisdiction in the United States that will pretend this is an island and isn't populated with Spanish-speaking people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add, like, it is a big umbrella, and that's the thing. We were looking at everything under the sun that is, like, as Fed said, like, they have certain roles for states, and then Puerto Rico is not a state, yet they treat it like every other state.
Mm-hmm.
And again, no real reality check for what the real issues are. Like, the fact that it's an island apparently was like a surprising thing to the Trump administration.
Oh my gosh.
Like, this is something that they
surrounded
were like,
with water.
Surrounded by water. You know?
Yeah.
And we laugh, but the fact is, like, those cookie cutter regulations can really hurt when you're not looking at the realities of what's on the ground and what the capabilities are of an island that is now, half in blackout and can't deliver aid.
So speaking of aid, this last action was focused on targeted programming for Puerto Ricans with mental health disabilities post-disaster, and that should be a priority for HHS and other agencies. Federico, can you give us a bit more context, shed some light on this last action? What does this mean?
Sure. So obviously, again, earthquakes, hurricanes are traumatic events. Puerto Rico's been going through a rough economic crisis. The out-migration crisis, 500,000 or more have left the island, according to the last census. So that's traumatic when families are divided. Whether they can legally get on a plane and see them anytime they want is another story, right? And so statistically speaking, when we compare the last statistics available, there's an agency in Puerto Rico called AMSCA. They are basically the ones in charge of providing public mental health services. They provided services to 300, I don't want to lie here, I think it's 307,000 in 2020. And in 2019, they only provided services to 90,000 people. I think that's obviously due to the pandemic. There's no way around it. There was a study that reported that 39% more Puerto Ricans are reporting anxiety due to the pandemic. And so because Puerto Rico's been suffering so much before the coronavirus crisis started, particular attention by specific federal agencies at HHS should look at providing more resources to mental health in Puerto Rico. And again, in a culturally competent way. It's not just language, but as you know, these are stereotypes, but they're true. Family is important. The way you approach people in Puerto Rico is important. Like, for the life of me, I can't get my Puerto Rican friends to stop fist bumping with me. I'm like, namaste, guys. We're still in a pandemic. I'm a touchy-feely guy, but not during the virus. So those are the intangible things that you need to put on the ground, but really the resources and the specific attention the problem requires. It's a very acute crisis of mental health in Puerto Rico.
Hearing these steps, I think they all sound like very logical steps that the executive branch can and should be able to take. Curious to hear from you both. We mentioned at the top of the show that we have an administration that's in charge right now that is more willing to listen than the previous administration. How realistic do you think any of these actions actually being implemented by the executive branch, how realistic do you think these are of happening?
First of all, I'd say we're pretty optimistic, and this is we're not, like you said, they seem like logical steps, but not a single one of these is a simple, easy step, right? So we're very cognizant of that. That being said, this administration from the very beginning, even before they came into office, were already talking to us and other Puerto Rico groups, very much paying attention and putting Puerto Rico as a priority, as is what we've seen so far in their policymaking and their thinking. They have put high-level people within the White House focused on Puerto Rico. And, while yes, absolutely, they have, what they have walked into, right, is a disaster of epic proportions throughout the country. And so we have to give them a little bit of grace. But that being said, what we have seen so far, like I said, even before they came into office, was that they were putting Puerto Rico as a priority and that they want to focus on it. And so we, of course, will continue to hold them to those promises. And we want to make sure that we are assisting them in any way that we can to get to the next step. And so this is not for us to sit back and say, okay, they're listening, so we're just going to let them do their thing. Our job is, of course, to continue to assist and to help push things in the right direction. But I'm very optimistic about many of these pieces getting done. In fact, I think it was Jen Psaki made a mention of the Jones Act the other day about the possibility of lifting that for a while. So not to say that's going to happen tomorrow. Again, very complicated, but there is certainly a focus at the White House, and so I'm very optimistic.
I completely agree with Laura. The White House and their senior level staff, both at the Economic Policy Council as well as several other key offices within the West Wing, have sat down with us virtually, obviously, several times, have asked us for information, have been available on email and on the phone, via Zoom. And so we're very confident that a lot of this can get done. And actually, many of them are things that the Biden administration promised to do. And we're actually trying to help them sequence and really figure how to do what they wanted to do in the first place, right? So I'm so confident that they'll reestablish the task force, because that will really help them, plan out and divide and conquer with the rest of their plan and the recommendations that we post. So that's why we also divided them between executive actions and collaboration with Congress, because we are confident that these are things that are up the administration's alley. Many are things that he already promised to do. We're just giving him the tools and recommendations on how to move forward. And with Congress, there are things that the administration can do to move the ball forward, even though they don't obviously control what is legislated on the Hill. They can propose, for example, manufacturing incentives in their first budget, equality under Medicaid, which is a big issue that's coming up in September, where Puerto Rico faces a fiscal cliff on Medicaid, where funding drops down significantly. And so in pandemic times, we don't want that to happen. And so we're just really laying the groundwork for the administration for them to have like a wonky roadmap, so that they're not in there figuring out, oh my God, there's these Puerto Rico problems, what are we gonna do? We lay them out for them, and we know that other experts are weighing in. There's a good community out there of think tanks, community activists, and experts that have made themselves available to, obviously, a White House that is a lot more open to constructive suggestions.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Federico, especially that the point that there is more to this article. We're just focusing on a little bit. And honestly, it feels like each of these actions could have been an episode in and of themselves. So just scratching the surface of what you all wrote. For people listening, you want to read the full article. It's on the Center for American Progress's website. It's titled An Urgent Rescue Plan for Puerto Rico.
Doors closing.
Local media outlets are essential. In 2020, as communities, businesses, and citizens came to terms with a pandemic that disrupted the flow of daily life, the need for accurate local information escalated. Information including which businesses were open, which were closed, where to get tested and vaccinated. When media organizations closed their newsrooms and went remote, the reporting did not stop. They held local government accountable, documented historic moments for social justice, shared the humanity behind tragedy. Meanwhile, the funding for that work was drying up. Businesses whose ads helped support the media were closed. Revenue disappeared. Donating today at SaveChicagoMedia.org can ensure your local newsroom continues reporting the stories that matter despite the current economy. Investing in local media is funding your community. Give today and help us do the work that matters. Donate now at SaveChicagoMedia.org.
Love asking our guests what their favorite spot to eat Puerto Rican food is. Federico, I know you shared where your favorite spots are. I think you may have shared places in Puerto Rico and not DC, but I could be wrong. Curious to hear from you, like DC, the island, wherever, what's one of your favorite spots to get Puerto Rican food?
So in DC, they have the Borinquen lunchbox, which I think Laura knows. They used to go to the Hill, and I used to see Republican Congressman Raúl Labrador buying his tripleta, which is literally a triple sandwich of pork, chicken, and red meat. All the great greasy Puerto Rican delight that you can imagine. And in Chicago, I don't know if it's still open, but back when I lived in Chicago in 2008, there was this restaurant in the Paseo called El Boquerón. I don't know if it's still there, but it used to be great.
Okay, Laura.
I'm gonna take you to DC suburbs.
Okay.
I live in Alexandria, and I've been stuck here for 14, 15 months now that we've been in lockdown. But La Famosa has some amazing pastries, Puerto Rican pastries that do not play. I mean, they're just amazing. So I'm partial to pork in general, but I've gotta go with the pastries at La Famosa for my favorite.
Okay, awesome. Shout out to La Famosa. Okay, Laura, let's stay with you. What is something you are obsessed with today? It can be related to or unrelated to Puerto Rican culture. It could be related to Colombian culture. What are you most obsessed with today?
I am a little bit obsessed with the January 6th events and commission. It has been something that I have not been able to really look away from, walk away from, and follow every single step of. It's, as someone who used to work on Capitol Hill, both inside and around it, it was a really awful day. An awful thing to watch. And so the aftermath of all of that has certainly been on my mind, and just is always kind of back there. A little lighter thing is I am a mother of two. I have a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I'm kind of obsessed with them too. My 2-year-old is no joke. She's a handful, and my 7-year-old is the sweetest boy. So obsessed mom, and also a little bit obsessed with politics.
Right on. Bonus question as a mother: what's been one of your biggest takeaways working from home with your kids in the house during the pandemic?
Be okay with the interruptions. It's all good. Everybody's got them. Your internet can go down. You can have no kids, but your internet goes down. It's an interruption, and everybody likes to see the kids on camera. There isn't I could be on a meeting with the president himself, and I bet he would be like, "Hey, your kids are there. How are they doing?"
Yeah.
It makes everybody happy. It's like seeing dogs on a camera too, right? Yeah. Like pets and kids, it's all good. So relax. It's okay, is what I now tell myself.
I dig that. I feel that on so many levels. It's interesting to see how the pandemic has shifted what those social or those professional norms are for video calls. I've been on calls where the dog takes up the screen, or the kid's like, I need your attention, mom or dad. And people are just like, yeah, this is normal. Let's get back to this spreadsheet. It's just like, okay, sounds good. I do. And I think it's a good shift. Federico, what about you? What are you obsessed with today?
Well, on a lighter issue, Middle East peace is obviously back. I hadn't obsessed about that in a while.
Gosh, you two are going
Oh my
heavy on this, which is fine. I welcome it. I welcome it.
And on an even lighter note, obviously, we have news that the Manhattan DA is forming a grand jury on the criminal investigation into the Trump organization, and having justice after a criminal, occupied the White House for 4 years would be nice. But hopefully, whatever that investigation leads to is just. If they don't find anything against Trump, great. At least they looked into it, and they have his taxes. And if somebody broke the law, they should pay. That should be a no-brainer. But for a while there, it was not necessarily a given. And I'm at least glad that I'm not that obsessed about democracy as much as I was during the last 4 years, even though it's still crucial. I don't have to think about it every 5 seconds anymore.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I appreciate you both for sharing the light stuff, the heavy stuff. I think we covered a lot of ground in this conversation. But for people that are listening, that want to keep the conversation going, that want to keep up with both of you, how can people stay up to date? Do you either of you have a website, social media? Give us all the things. Federico, let's start with you. How can people stay up to date with what you have going on?
Sure. So I wouldn't be doing my job as a consultant for CAP if I didn't plug CAP and CAP en Español and CAP Action. Follow them on all of the social media platforms, please. My personal handle on Twitter is @FDeJesusFebles, and my company @FDJ Solutions DC. And we're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the whole shebang.
Great. Laura, what about you?
Well, Fede got cat for me. So I'm not super active, but I do have a handle on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is @ThisIsElrod. It's a little like inside joke for I got the Elrod nickname when I was working for the State Department, and the staffers on the Foreign Affairs Committee gave me that nickname, and I said, you know what, I'm going to embrace it. So This Is Elrod, @ThisIsElrod is my Twitter handle. And of course, a lot of my work is on CAP. And I am, actively tweeting and retweeting all of the amazing work that is coming out of the Center for American Progress. So please do follow us there.
Was that, Laura, bonus question, was that inspired by A-Rod? Is that why it was?
I believe so. So.
If we had time, I would what do you think about Jennifer Lopez and Ben Affleck getting together? She's no longer with A-Rod anymore. Bennifer's back.
I've got opinions.
Round 2 of the Paseo podcast. We already got it locked in. Okay. Laura Rodriguez, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Center for American Progress, and Federico A. de Jesus, Advisor for the Center of American Progress. Thank you both for being on the Paseo podcast today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Doors closing.
Los medios de comunicación locales son esenciales. En 2020, cuando las comunidades, las empresas y los ciudadanos se enfrentaron a una pandemia que interrumpió el flujo de la vida cotidiana, aumentó la necesidad de información local precisa. Información que incluyera qué negocios estaban abiertos, cuáles cerrados, dónde hacerse las pruebas, dónde encontrar ayuda. Pero cuando los medios de comunicación cerraron sus redacciones y se alejaron, la información no se detuvo. Exigieron responsabilidades al gobierno local, documentaron momentos históricos para la justicia social, compartieron la humanidad detrás de la tragedia. Mientras tanto, la financiación de ese trabajo se estaba agotando. Las empresas cuyos anuncios ayudaban a sostener los medios de comunicación cerraron o se paralizaron. Los ingresos desaparecieron. Donar hoy en SaveChicagoMedia.org puede garantizar que su redacción local siga informando de las historias que importan a pesar de la economía actual. Invertir en los medios de comunicación locales es financiar tu comunidad. Dona hoy para ayudarnos a hacer el trabajo que importa. Dona ahora en SaveChicagoMedia.org.